The galaxy had grown used to the noise of humanity for 300 years, ever since humans had stumbled onto the galactic stage. They had been impossibly loud and chaotic and messy in everything they did, and the older species had watched them with a mixture of amusement and annoyance that never quite went away. Their radio waves polluted every corner of space, and their ships screamed through the void with engines that traded elegance for raw, brutal power. And their colonies sprouted overnight on worlds that the elder races had declared impossible to settle. And their music and their arguments and their laughter bled across every frequency until it seemed like there was no escaping them. The Conclave of 12, the ancient governing body that had ruled the Milky Way for 400,000 years, had debated endlessly about what to do with humanity. But they had never reached a conclusion because humans were too chaotic to ignore and too stubborn to control and too useful to destroy. And then one day, without any warning at all, Earth went silent. Ambassador Cathvoran of the Silurian Dominion was the first to notice because his species had evolved to sense electromagnetic fields. And the sudden absence of Earth's constant chatter hit him like a physical blow. During a routine session at the Conclave station, he stood up from his seat and his iridescent scales rippled with distress as he announced to the chamber that something was terribly wrong and that Earth had stopped transmitting within hours. The news had spread to every corner of the galaxy, and scout vessels were dispatched to investigate, but they found nothing except silence. And the human colonies throughout the sector had gone dark as well. And billions of humans across hundreds of worlds had simply stopped talking. The Conclave convened an emergency session, and theories flew through the air like frightened birds, with some suggesting a plague and others proposing civil war, and still others wondering if some massive technological failure had struck humanity all at once. The Kathmari Collective, who had been humanity's rivals since the border wars, could barely hide their satisfaction at the news. And their ambassador made comments about how chaos always consumed itself in the end. But the Luminary Elders, ancient beings of living crystal who had watched civilizations rise and fall for longer than most species had existed, exchanged glances that made everyone who noticed them feel deeply unsettled. Only Elder Thesan of the Luminari spoke, the fear that everyone else was too afraid to voice. She rose from her seat and her crystalline form hummed with frequencies of deep concern as she told the assembly that when prey animals in a forest suddenly fall silent, it is because they have sensed a predator that the hunters have not yet noticed. The chamber went quiet, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. High Consul Moravan, the leader of the Conclave, finally broke the silence by asking what could possibly frighten humanity into silence. Because everyone knew that humans were afraid of nothing and would fight anything, and had never once backed down from a challenge in their entire chaotic history. No one had an answer, but 3 days later, when the first black ships emerged from the void beyond the galactic rim, the Conclave finally understood what had terrified humanity into silence. The ships were enormous beyond comprehension, each one larger than a small moon, and they moved through space with a grace that seemed to mock the laws of physics. And their hulls were so dark that they seemed to drink in the light around them. The Luminari recognized them immediately because their species kept records that stretched back 400,000 years. And those records spoke of a horror that had come before, a horror that had wiped out entire civilizations and consumed everything in its path. The harvesters had returned. Ambassador Cathvoran watched the sensor data with growing horror as more and more of the black ships emerged from the tier in space. And he counted 1,000 and then 10,000, and then he stopped counting because the numbers had lost all meaning. He turned to Elder Thesan and asked her what these things were and why nobody had ever warned the younger species about them. The Luminari Elder was quiet for a long moment before she answered. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 400 millennia of guilt. She explained that the harvesters came every few 100,000 years, and that they consumed everything. Every species in every world and every trace of civilization. And that the Luminari had survived the last harvest only by hiding, and by staying silent, and by letting other species be taken in their place. The chamber erupted in outrage and accusations. But Thiessen continued speaking over the noise. She said that warning the younger species would have done nothing except cause panic, because there was no defense against the harvesters, and no weapon that could harm them, and no strategy that had ever worked against them in all the long history of the galaxy. But now, she said, something strange had happened. Something that had never happened before in all the cycles of harvest that the Luminari had witnessed. Humanity had known they were coming somehow. Impossibly, the humans had detected the harvesters before they arrived. And instead of panicking or fleeing or begging for help, they had gone silent. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream could ever be. High Consul Moravin demanded to know how this was possible. Because humans had only been a spacefaring species for 3 centuries, and they could not possibly have technology that the elder races lacked. Thiessen shook her crystalline head and said that she did not know how they had detected the harvesters. But she knew what the silence meant when humans were loud and chaotic and messy. It meant they were playing, she said. But when humans went quiet, it meant they were preparing for war. The conclave watched in helpless horror as the harvester fleet began to move toward the outer colonies. And they sent desperate messages to human space, begging for information and offering assistance. But the only response was silence, and in that silence, the galaxy began to understand something that it had never understood before. Humanity had never been chaotic at all. They had been waiting. While the galaxy erupted in the panic and chaos and fear, humanity did something that no species had ever seen them do before. They prepared in perfect and terrifying coordination. Admiral Shan Wei stood in the war room buried deep beneath the mountains of New Geneva, and she watched holographic displays that showed every human world executing identical protocols with a precision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had observed humanity's chaotic behavior over the past 3 centuries. There were no arguments and no political debates and no dissent of any kind. And 300 years of carefully performed division and petty squabbles evaporated like morning frost in the rising sun. Director Okonkwo stood beside her, and her voice carried the weight of a deception that had spanned generations as she said that they had bought it, and that for 3 centuries the entire galaxy had believed that humanity was nothing but chaos given form. Admiral Chan nodded and replied that they had needed the galaxy to believe that lie. Because if the elder races had ever discovered what humanity was really building and what they were really preparing for, they would have tried to stop them, and stopping them would have meant the end of everything. The truth of humanity's history would have seemed like madness to any outside observer. But Admiral Chun knew every detail because it had been passed down through her family for 12 generations. When the first human colony ships had breached the galactic barrier 300 years ago, their deep space sensors had detected something strange buried in the quantum foam of space itself. And when the scientists had finally decoded the signal, they had discovered a message left by a species called the Architects, who had been extinct for 400,000 years. The message was a warning. It said that they would return, and that they harvested all who rose, and that the only hope was to prepare or perish. The leaders of humanity had gathered in secret, and they had made a choice that would shape the next 3 centuries. And they had decided to hide their true capabilities from everyone in the galaxy, including their own people. They would play the role of chaotic newcomers who stumbled through galactic politics while making embarrassing mistakes. And they would build the largest military infrastructure in the history of the galaxy in absolute secret. Every civilian station was designed as a hidden fortress. And every cargo ship carried weapons that would make the elder races weep with terror. And every human child from birth was secretly trained in the ancient arts of war that humanity had supposedly abandoned centuries ago. The neural implants that every human received at age 5 were not just for communication, as the galaxy believed, but were designed to link human minds together into a network of unimaginable power. And now, watching the feeds from the galactic rim that showed the Harvester Vanguard emerging from the darkness, Admiral Chun knew that the moment they had prepared for had finally arrived. She asked Director Okonkwo how long they had until the Harvesters reached the core worlds. The director pulled up tactical projections and said that at their current pace, the Harvesters would arrive in approximately 18 months. But they would strip the outer colonies first, taking the Silurian frontier and the Kathmari border worlds and consuming everything they found. Admiral Chun asked about the Conclave and what they were doing in response to the threat. Director Okonkwo told up diplomatic intercepts and shook her head as she explained that the Conclave was still debating whether to surrender or flee, and that the Luminari were advocating for something called a negotiated harvest, where certain species would be offered up to buy time for others, and that the Kathmari were already loading their generation ships. Admiral Chun called them cowards, but she understood their fear, because how could they possibly know the truth about the Harvesters? When the Luminari had kept it secret for so long, the Harvesters did not negotiate, and they did not accept tribute, and they did not leave survivors, because they were a force as old as the galaxy itself, and every species that had ever stood against them existed now only as scattered molecules in dead star systems. A young officer approached Admiral Chun, and her expression was grave as she reported that Project Prometheus was complete and that all 1,200 stations were online and awaiting orders. Admiral Chun closed her eyes for a moment and thought about what those stations represented, because they were not ordinary weapons, but something far more terrible. They had been built using principles described in the architect's warning, and they could create a force that was anathema to the quantum substrate that harvested technology depended upon. She asked about Project Orpheus, and the officer hesitated before answering that the volunteers were ready and that all 40 million of them had confirmed their participation. 40 million human beings who had agreed to upload their consciousness into the targeting systems of the weapons array, becoming one with the machines, their minds distributed across a network of quantum processors that could react at speeds no conventional system could match. They would almost certainly not survive the process, because no human mind had ever endured such integration for more than a few hours. Admiral Chun gave the order to begin the awakening protocol and told the officer to send one message to the Conclave, unencrypted so that everyone in the galaxy could hear it. The officer asked what the message should say. Admiral Chun smiled, and it was not a kind smile, but the smile of a predator that had finally stopped pretending to be prey. "Tell them to stay out of our way," she said, and across human space, billions of humans who had spent their entire lives pretending to be chaotic and undisciplined suddenly revealed their true nature. The silence ended, and the galaxy learned what humanity had really been doing for the past 300 years. Across the galaxy, they had always been told that humanity was a joke. Commander Vexilor of the Kathmari Third Fleet remembered laughing at human tactics during the border wars, because their refusal to use proper formations and their chaotic deployments that seemed almost random had made them easy prey for Kathmari discipline and coordination. His fleet had won every engagement, through superior tactics, and he had filed reports mocking the primitive human approach to warfare. Now, watching the sensor data streaming in from the Silurian frontier, he finally understood the terrible joke that had been played on the entire galaxy. Human ships were emerging from hiding places that should not have existed at all, rising from inside gas giants and from the hearts of stars, and from hollowed-out asteroids that Kathmari surveys had scanned and dismissed as worthless rocks. They rose like ghosts from every corner of human space, and their numbers kept growing and growing until the sensors could barely keep track of them, all in the Harvester vanguard. Encountering this unexpected resistance did something that made Commander Vexiller's blood run cold in his veins. They hesitated in 400,000 years of recorded Harvester behavior, in all the secret records that the Luminari had kept hidden from the younger species. The Harvesters had never once hesitated before any opponent. Commander Vexillar's sensor officer spoke with a trembling voice and said that he was detecting formation patterns in the human deployment, and that they were not random at all, but were instead incredibly complex and coordinated. The commander's mandibles clicked in disbelief as he realized the truth. The humans had always been coordinated, and every chaotic battle and every undisciplined engagement had been nothing but a performance designed to make their enemies underestimate them. They had been testing the galaxy and learning the capabilities of every species and making everyone believe they were fools while they built weapons in the shadows. The scale of the deception was staggering, and Commander Vexiller felt a strange mixture of anger and admiration as he watched the human fleet engage the Harvester vanguard. Meanwhile, on the Conclave station, Ambassador Kethvorin stood before a holographic figure that called itself the Speaker for Humanity. He had never seen a human like this one before, because this human was calm and cold and completely without the emotional volatility that had defined their species in every previous encounter. The Speaker told the Conclave that they needed to fall back to the core worlds and consolidate their fleets behind the human defensive line, and that they should not engage the Harvesters under any circumstances. Ambassador Kethvorin demanded to know if the humans expected the Conclave to simply abandon the outer Ptolemies and the trillions of lives that would be lost. Speaker's expression did not change as it explained that those lives would be lost regardless, because the Harvesters did not take prisoners and did not negotiate, and consumed everything, including organic matter and synthetic constructs, and even the quantum information states that comprise consciousness itself. They were entropy given purpose, the Speaker said, and humanity had known this for 300 years and had prepared accordingly. The only chance the galaxy had for survival was to stay behind the human defensive line and let humanity do what it had been born to do. Ambassador Kethvorin asked what that meant. Speaker smiled, and for the first time Kethvorin understood why the Luminari had always seemed afraid of humanity, even when they were pretending to be chaotic fools. Die, the Speaker said, and die so thoroughly and so catastrophically that we take them with us. The battle was joined at the Viridian Gap, where the first major Harvester wave met the human defensive line in a clash that shook the fabric of space itself. Elder Thyssen of the Luminari watched the engagement through a viewing crystal that showed her probability strings rather than visual data, and she could see every possible future branching out from this moment. In every stream she could perceive, the humans lost, their ships were destroyed, and their worlds were consumed, and their species was erased from existence. In every single probability she could see, but in every stream something else happened too, something that her probability side could not fully resolve, a blind spot in causality that she had never encountered before. The Harvesters In every future where they defeated humanity, emerged damaged and weakened and changed in ways that are ancient. Mind could not understand, she whispered to herself, that the humans knew they could not win and that they had always known. And they were going to fight anyway. For the first time in 400,000 years, Elder Thiessen felt something that she thought her species had evolved beyond long ago. She felt hope, because she understood now that humanity had never been trying to win. They had been trying to wound the harvesters badly enough that the rest of the galaxy might have a chance, and watching the human ships throw themselves into battle with a fury that defied all reason, Thiessen made a decision that would change everything. She opened a channel to the Luminari fleet, which had stayed hidden and safe for 400 millennia. "It is time," she said, "for us to stop hiding and start fighting the other Luminari." Protested and said that they had survived by staying neutral and that breaking that neutrality would mean their destruction. Thiessen shook her crystalline head and said that there was no more neutrality, because the humans were showing them what courage looked like, and the Luminari could either join them or die as cowards. One by one the other elders agreed, and for the first time in 400,000 years, the Luminari went to war. The Battle of Viridian Gap lasted 11 days, and it was the bloodiest conflict in the history of the galaxy. For the first 3 days, the galaxy watched in stunned and horrified silence as human ships threw themselves against the Harvester vanguard in waves of suicidal fury that made no tactical sense to any observer. They used tactics that no sane species would ever consider, ramming their ships directly into Harvester vessels and detonating antimatter warheads at point-blank range and deliberately crashing their fighters into enemy hulls to detonate their fusion cores from within. By day 4, the human losses were catastrophic, and 80% of their forward fleet had been reduced to scattered debris floating in the void between stars. Billions of humans had died in the cold darkness of space, and the Conclave Watchers began to prepare for the inevitable defeat. But then, Harvesters reached the first major human world, a colony called Prometheus Station that was home to 200 million humans, living in an artificial ringworld that orbited a dying star. The Harvesters expected surrender, because every species in history had surrendered when faced with their overwhelming power. What they found instead was something that had never happened before. As the first Harvester vessel entered orbit, every single human on Prometheus Station activated their neural implant at exactly the same moment. 200 million minds linked together in a single terrible instant of unified purpose, and their combined consciousness reached out and touched the station's reactor, which the Harvesters had scanned and identified as a standard fusion power plant. But it was not a reactor at all. It was a bomb. A weapon designed using principles that the architects had encoded in their ancient warning. A device that could briefly create a new fundamental force of nature that was the opposite of everything the Harvesters were made of. Prometheus Station detonated in a flash of light that could be seen across half the galaxy. 300 Harvester vessels simply ceased to exist in that moment, not exploding or breaking apart, but simply stopping. The dark energy that had sustained their impossible technology for millions of years snuffed out like a candle flame in a hurricane. Harvesters reeled back in shock, and for the first time in their existence, they felt something that they had never felt before. They felt fear on Earth. Admiral Chen Wei watched the data feeds with tears streaming down her face, because 200 million volunteers had just died in an instant, and their families would never recover their bodies, and their children would grow up knowing that their parents had chosen to become weapons. She asked how many more stations were ready to sacrifice themselves. The answer Was 1199, she asked. About the Harvester response, and the tactical display showed that the Harvester fleet, which had numbered over 50,000 vessels at the start of the engagement, had pulled back and was regrouping. Director Okonkwo said grimly that the Harvesters were learning and that they would find countermeasures because they always found countermeasures. Eventually, Admiral Chun knew they had to hit the Harvesters again before they could adapt. And she ordered the initiation of Phase 2, but she also knew something else. Something she had always known deep in her heart. Humanity could hurt the Harvesters, and they could bleed them. But they could not destroy them alone. She ordered a message sent to the Conclave. A simple message that contained only one question. We have shown you that they can be killed. And now we ask if you will help us finish this. For 12 agonizing hours, there was only silence from the Conclave, and then, one by one, the replies began to arrive. The Silurian Dominion was the first to respond, pledging their entire fleet to the human cause. The Kethmari Collective followed, their leaders filled with shame after watching humans die to protect Kethmari frontier colonies. Even the Luminari, breaking 400 millennia of careful neutrality, committed their crystalline warships to the fight. Admiral Chun opened a channel to every human colony world, to every man and woman and child who still remained after the losses they had suffered. She introduced herself and explained that she was speaking not as an admiral, but as a human being asking other human beings to make an impossible choice. She told them that the Harvesters would not stop and would not negotiate and had consumed 1,000 civilizations before humanity, but that humanity had discovered something in the 3 centuries. Since they first learned of the threat, the Harvesters were afraid of humans. Not because humans were stronger or smarter, but because humans were willing to do what no other species had ever done. Die standing up and fighting and taking as many of the enemy with them as possible. She asked for volunteers, not soldiers but martyrs. Human beings willing to link their consciousness to the weapons array and become living weapons against an enemy that had never faced anything like them. She told them honestly that they would not survive, and that none of them might survive, but that their children might live and their grandchildren might live, and 1,000 generations after them might live because humanity chose to be the wall that darkness broke against. She asked who would stand with her. Across human space, the responses flooded in. Millions of volunteers, and then tens of millions, and then hundreds of millions. So many that the array could not possibly accommodate them. All humanity had given its answer, and the galaxy, watching this display of courage and sacrifice, finally understood what it meant to be human. It meant fighting even when you knew you could not win. It meant dying so that others might live. It meant being the light that refused to go out even when surrounded by infinite darkness. The final battle took place in the empty void between galaxies, where no star had ever burned and no world had ever formed. The combined fleet of the Conclave, the largest armada ever assembled in galactic history, had driven the Harvesters back from the core worlds through months of brutal fighting that had cost trillions of lives across every species. But the enemy had retreated to their origin point, a massive structure beyond the galactic rim that the Luminari called the Wound, a tear in the fabric of space and time itself through which the Harvesters had first emerged 400,000 years ago to truly end the threat forever. The wound had to be sealed, and the only force capable of sealing it was the array, the network of human minds and human weapons that had been built for this singular purpose. Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of the Last Hope, humanity's final flagship, and around her, the remains of the human fleet formed a protective sphere around the array's core vessels. Those ships carried not weapons but something far more precious: the uploaded consciousnesses of 900 million volunteers who had chosen to become humanity's final weapon. A young officer reported that the array was fully synchronized and that all stations were ready. But she also reported massive energy built up at the wound because the harvesters knew what was coming and were trying to open the barrier wider and bring through reinforcements from whatever dark dimension they called home. Admiral Chun asked how long they had. The answer was minutes, maybe less. She gave the order for all ships to engage and buy the array whatever time it needed. The battle that followed would become legend, sung about by species that had not yet evolved, on worlds that had not yet formed. Silurian cruisers decorated with the names of consumed worlds threw themselves into the enemy formation without hesitation. Kethmari warriors fighting alongside humans for the first time in their species' history screamed ancient war cries as they died. Even the Luminari, who had not engaged in physical combat for 100,000 years, directed their crystalline vessels into the heart of the bite of the harvester fleet and shattered themselves against the darkness. The losses were staggering. An entire species lost half their remaining population in the span of hours. But they held the line. They held and they bled the harvesters, and they gave the array the time it needed in the quantum space, where 900 million human minds had merged together. Something new was being born, something that had never existed before in the history of the universe. They called themselves the Chorus. They were no longer individual humans with individual thoughts and dreams. But they were not quite a single entity either, instead becoming something in between. A vast distributed consciousness that could perceive space and time itself as a malleable thing that could be shaped and changed. They saw the wound not as a tear in reality, but as a wrong note, played in an infinite symphony, and they understood how to correct it. The chorus spoke, and their voice resonated through every ship in the fleet as they announced that they were ready, but that the price was higher than they had anticipated. Admiral Chun closed her eyes and asked them to tell her. The chorus explained that to seal the wound they would have to become the seal itself. Their consciousness stretched and distributed across the barrier between dimensions, and they would not exactly die, but they would no longer be human, instead becoming something eternal and unchanging. Admiral Chun asked if they could still complete the mission. There was a pause, the first hesitation the chorus had shown since their formation. They said they could, but they wanted to ask permission first, from Admiral Chun and from everyone who was fighting and dying around them. They were asking permission to sacrifice themselves, all 900 million of them, to become the guardians of the galaxy forever. The wall between this reality and whatever horror lay beyond, protecting every species and every world and every child, born from now until the stars themselves burned out. But they would never come home. Admiral Chun thought of her own children and her grandchildren, and all the generations of humans who would live because of what happened. In this moment, she told them to do it, as she thanked them, thanked all of them for their sacrifice. The chorus sang. It was not a sound that could be heard with ears, but a vibration in the fabric of reality itself, a harmonic frequency that the Luminari would later describe as the voice of the universe correcting a 400,000-year-old mistake. The wound began to close. The harvesters screamed, not in communication, but in genuine terror, because for the first time in their eternal existence, they understood what it felt like to be prey. They tried to flee, but the wound was collapsing around them, and the chorus was everywhere, their distributed consciousness forming walls of pure will that no amount of dark energy could breach. One by one, the harvester vessels were drawn into the closing rift. Their fleet compressed into the shrinking wound until there was nothing left but a single point of darkness. And then even that was gone. Where the wound had been, there was now something new. A constellation of light made up of billions of tiny stars arranged in patterns that seemed almost like writing. The Luminari would spend centuries trying to decipher it, and the Kethmari would build temples facing that point in space. And humanity would simply call it what it was, the Wall, 1,000 years later. Ambassador Chun, a descendant of the admiral who had commanded the final battle, stood before the galactic conclave and looked up at the wall shimmering in the distance. She told the assembly that once a year, on the anniversary of the battle, the wall spoke. A single message broadcast across every frequency and reaching every world in the galaxy. For 1,000 years, the message had been the same. We hold the line so you can live, and we ask only that you make it worth our sacrifice. She looked around the chamber at the hundreds of species who had once feared humanity, and now stood beside them as equals and friends. We have tried, she said. Every day, we have tried to build a galaxy worthy of their sacrifice. A galaxy where species work together instead of consuming each other. A galaxy where the strong protect the weak. A galaxy where the silence between the stars is filled with hope instead of fear. Outside the viewport, the wall pulsed once. A single flash of light that every species in the galaxy could see. The chorus was still watching, and they were proud.